going to show you some lessons we learned from our study regarding food sovereignty on the French and European markets, and what about the pork meat dynamic, because this study comes within a context in which the pig industry has been impacted by a number of crises, different types of crises, sanitary, COVID, swine fever, and geopolitical and climate-related issues. These crises have exacerbated the discussion of food sovereignty. And in the notion of food sovereignty, we confuse self-sufficiency, independence in the markets, but there is no consensus regarding what we mean exactly by sovereignty. And this is the reason why in our study we focused on the definition of the food sovereignty as suggested by some researchers at INRAE. I've included the definition on my slide, but to keep it simple, we consider that sovereignty, food sovereignty, is a market's capacity to cover its own population's needs with its own production, while controlling the way it may depend on other external markets. The framework of this study was to characterize external dependencies of the pig and the pork industry, and for this reason we followed we took two angles. We quantified the balance between the supply and demand, and we tried to identify the factors which may make our food sovereignty more fragile in our countries. We looked at a macroeconomic approach to begin with, and also an approach through our supply balance. And what do I mean by supply balance? We look at the volumes of produced quantities for a given territory, and we look at how these volumes are being used. We look at data such as production, apparent consumption, and external trade exchanges. And based on these three types of data, we chose three indicators. The first one is the rate of self-supply, which is the ratio between production and consumption, and it reflects the country's capacity to meet its population's needs. Then the next indicator was the ratio between imports and consumptions, imported goods and consumption, which shows an unbalance in the offer and demand on the market, and also the fact that the production of finished products is not balanced with the consumers' needs. And finally, the last ratio is the share of production exported. It shows a strategic orientation of an industry for a given country. We took the European perimeter, and we could therefore make an international comparison with other markets. The first lesson we learned is that there is a huge heterogeneity of situations within the European market. If you look at the average self-supply rate between 2008 and 2023, we see huge disparities between European markets. 6 markets are producing a surplus in Northern Europe: Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. We have a few countries which seem to be just balanced, with France included, where production and consumption are more or less matching. And then we have a large number of countries in Europe who are consuming more than they produce. Eastern European countries, where this production system, for instance, because of a number of weaknesses, such as a very uneven sanitary status, very heterogeneous economic performances, we're not able to develop a production system solid enough to meet the population's needs, which means that in Europe, surplus and shortage are sort of balancing each other out. We see that in Europe, we can say that the European market altogether produces a surplus. And we have diversity in the markets, but also the characteristics of the markets and their dependence on imports. For instance, many countries depend very much on imported goods. Imported goods represent more than 50% of the consumed volumes. And we have 2 countries, Northern Europe and Eastern Europe countries, belonging to that category. Northern European countries, because they are in the middle of Europe at the crossroad between the exchanges of live animals and meat. They have many slaughterhouses, and they need to receive animals from abroad to keep their slaughterhouses running and remain profitable. We then have Eastern European countries. They depend a lot on imports because they don't produce enough, and because the trade across border is very dynamic between Slovenia and Slovakia, for instance. They trade a lot across the border. We then have a smaller quantity of countries where they don't depend so much on imported goods, but still between 30 and 50%. Places like Germany, Portugal, they depend on imported goods, especially to meet the demands of slaughterhouses and cutting companies that prepare the meat. And within this European panel, we have a few countries that depend from imported goods in a very limited way: France, Spain, and Finland. And these countries stand out from the rest of the group of countries. Another lesson we learned from our study: these European balances can be disrupted. And here we have an example of a disrupting factor: closing third markets to exports. 2023 was a very special year. We had a very specific sanitary situation which was not very good for exports. And the economic situation was also not favorable for exports. There was very high inflation, and therefore European meat was more expensive than maybe meat from outside of Europe. And this situation led to a rebalancing in the market, with some countries that were exporting initially more products towards third-party countries, and they had to stop doing so. Spain, for instance, between 2020 and 2022, Spain was exporting about 40% towards other European countries. In 2023, it was 60%. So we saw that there was a very strong dynamic in a very short period of time. And these disruptions in the market led to unbalance and a lot of pressure on imports for other European countries. And this pressure led to our food sovereignty becoming more fragile, more unstable. European markets are likely to be rendered more fragile by the economic situation. And in the whole panel, we find that the French market stands out because it does a reverse compared with its competitors. The French market seems to be relatively resilient, solid, both in terms of production and consumption. And we see that the two are overlapping, and we also see that self-supply ratio is approximately 100%. Dependence on imported goods is very limited, and dependence on exported goods is also very limited. So what is happening in France is almost an exception compared with the other European countries. The last lesson I wanted to share with you: not only are we looking into what is happening inside of Europe, but we're also looking at the other world markets, because the current economic situation is not very favorable for European markets. Pig production is decreasing, and it is a trend, so it's going to continue. Whereas in terms of demand, the European consumers are still consuming the same quantity of pork meat, and the European population is increasing, and the economic environment is such that there are still free trade agreements being signed between European and world countries. So the world markets, what do they look like? We have some big producers who produce a surplus: Canada, Brazil, United States. They have a rate of self-supply that is above 100%. But the question is, are these markets looking towards the European market? And the answer is yes, except that there are two conditions for them to gain access to the European market. One, they have to meet with our standards and breeding standards, which is not the case right now. And the second condition is an economic condition. There must be a competitive competition between these countries and the European country. And if Brazil wants to export meat to our countries, then the meat quality should be comparable, and the exporting companies should also be competitive. Now, for now, this risk of pressure from other markets trying to export to our countries is limited because, again, we still produce enough for our own consumption. And therefore, there is still not quite a balance here. The question of self-sufficiency, food sovereignty is still very much open. The economic situation is not very favorable for the pig industry, the pork industry, and our economic approach has allowed us to look at how the markets are evolving and where they can find a balance. As Valérie was saying, the balance-based approach is very complete. Some products are not, but it's not complete enough because there's some products are not taken in consideration, such as offal, and also we did not look in the quality of the products being imported and the European consumers' expectations towards the quality. We also did not look at a number of other elements that may influence food sovereignty, food production tools, because our food sovereignty depends on the balance in terms of volume, but it also depends on the competitiveness of our production tools, our breeding farms, our slaughterhouses, our cutting companies, and their capacity to meet the consumers' expectations. And to take this one step further, it would be interesting to have a multidimensional approach. And also it might be interesting to benchmark with other industries, vegetable products or other animal products. Maybe we could be inspired by their best practices and see how they have evolved in time. Thank you very much for your attention. I would also like to thank Inaport for their funding, because this is how we were able to monitor the market by gaining access to external data. Thank you very much.